Okay, today we're going to talk about the nervous system and the brain and the cells that make up that nervous system and brain. The brain is part of the nervous system. Within the brain itself, I mean, you've probably heard that we don't get neurons back. So if you kill them, you're stuck. There's one exception to that now. We know that in one part of the brain, you do get some cells back. Anyway, we have about 3 trillion cells making up the brain. And some of those are support cells, and some of those are the cells that do the communication. The cells that do the communication are called neurons. Some of those cells actually take in stimulation from the environment and will send information to the brain, like when the cells in our retina pick up light waves, they'll send information to the brain. So those are sensory neurons. Then we have motor neurons that end on muscles, like in my finger, that make it twitch. So that's a motor neuron. And then interneurons are the ones that connect the sensory motor neurons and connect to each other. This is what an artist's rendering of a single neuron can look like. This is the building block of the whole nervous system. These are the communication cells that allow us to do everything. Think, blink, feel things, breathe, have a heart rate going, everything. I mean, if we didn't have this, we'd be dead. So today, the main focus is to talk about individual structures in this neuron. So I'm going to name those structures and then talk about how a message gets communicated across the length of that whole cell. So that's today's lecture. The next video is going to be how one neuron communicates to the next neuron. So today, it's just the basic. How does a message go across a single individual cell? These are the different parts, and I'll refer to these and show you other pictures. Here are a couple of actual photographs from, I guess, electron microscopes showing these individual neurons. We have these parts, which I'll refer to. I'm moving the cursor across these words so you can see it. The dendrite, the cell body, the axon, the myelin sheath, and terminal branches and terminal buttons. All these are described in your book, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about them. So I think this chapter is a good one to come up with flashcards. So you can say, what's the structure? Dendrite, what's its function to do this? Structure, function, structure, function. And if you do flashcards that way, you'll do, I think, really well in this particular chapter. So let's start with that, with a dendrite. So I'm going to talk about those structures and functions, and then I'm going to kind of go back and forth, kind of what happens here. Here is another kind of cartoon drawing of a neuron. And you see it labeled dendrites, and those dendrites receive messages from other cells. So this neuron is like a link in a chain. So if my hand is kind of the dendrites and my arm is the axon, and this is the cell body here, you have other neurons coming right up next to, but not touching, the dendrites of the cell and releasing chemicals all over the dendrites. So the dendrites' job is to receive chemical messages. Those messages are collected and sent to the cell body. Then you have that axon. This is a long tail. It's kind of like the electrical cord of this cell. That's where the overall message is being sent. You can think about it like an Ethernet cord, because it's actually information that's being electrical information that's being transmitted across that whole axon. And then you have the axon terminals. That's where chemicals get released onto the next neuron. So, and I do want to talk about that. Do you see these little yellow cells that are on this purple neuron? Those are little fatty cells called myelin, and they insulate the chemical message that's being sent across this neuron, and they protect it. So I will say a little bit more about that as we go through the steps in what we call an action potential, or nerve impulse is also called. So these are the 6 different steps, and I'm going to go through these kind of a single step at a time. Usually when I'm talking about this in class, I draw it on the board and kind of act out some of this. It's a little different in the video. So what we know about an individual neuron, there are little electrically charged chemicals inside and outside the cell. because our whole body is a fluid-filled environment, and you just have like little chemical particles everywhere. And they have charges, positive and negative charges. Those ions, they're called ions, exist inside the neuron and outside the neuron. When our neuron, before any message is being sent, is just at rest, and we call it the resting state, you have more negative ions on the inside of it, giving it a charge of negative 70 millivolts. Now, to give you an idea of how much that would be, if you know what a D battery is, a D battery has about 1500 millivolt power. So, you know, this little neuron by itself, when it's resting alone, has a lot more negative ions on the inside, so it's got a little zing to it. It's ready, basically. Then what happens, I'm gonna go back to that picture. You have, again, if my arm is like the dendrites here, the cell body, and the axon, I can't really do the axon terminal, you have stimulation coming from other neurons, and they're dropping chemicals all over the dendrites of this cell. And some of those chemicals are excitatory and some are inhibitory. The excitatory says, send a message, we need you to send this. The inhibitory says, nah, just stay at rest, don't do that. What we know, if we get enough excitatory messages in comparison to inhibitory messages, this particular neuron is going to reach its level of, like, it's called a threshold, it's crossover point. So if you look at the next term we have here, first the cell's at rest, it gets stimulation from other neurons. And then if it reaches this threshold of excitation, it's like, I have no choice, I have to send this message to other neurons. And that's going to change what's going on in that particular cell. We'll go back to this picture. When that happens, you can't see me pointing with my finger, so I'm going to try to point with a cursor. When these dendrites end up getting enough stimulation that it reaches the threshold, little pores open right here where the cell body meets up with the tail or the axon of the neuron. When that happens, there are a lot of positive ions on the outside of this cell. Remember, there are negative ones on the inside. And because opposites attract, what's going to happen if these little pores or these little gates open right here, those positive ions are going to rush in there, changing that portion of the neuron to a positive 40 millivolt charge. Soon as that happens, that sets up a chain reaction across the entire axon. I want to upload a video so you can watch this on our Canvas page. And those pores start to open, kind of like dominoes falling down, like that. And these pores start to open. As the pores open along the entire, again, here, if you have the dendrite cell body, axon, as these pores open along this whole length of the axon, positive ions rush inside it. And then so you have this positive charge happening and moving across the entire axon. So that is called the action potential itself. When that happens, by the time the positive charges reaches these axon terminals here at the end, and we're going to talk a lot about this in the next video, because these axon terminals contain chemicals that will be released. When the positive charges reaches these axon terminals, where's my arrow? That's going to force the release of chemicals. Those chemicals are called neurotransmitters. So the next step is neurotransmitters released from the terminal buttons into the synapse. Now the synapse is just a gap. Remember I said that the cells don't actually touch each other. There's a little space between them. So when you have the positive charge reaching all the way down to the end of the axon terminals, that's going to release those chemicals into that little gap where they'll be picked up by the dendrites of the next cell. And the whole process starts all over again. Now, in order for this neuron to send another message, it has to return to its original state, which is its resting potential. Keep in mind, that's a negative 70 millivolt charge. So what happens, there's these little pumps, cell pumps basically, inside this neuron that after that action potential shoots across the entire cell, those pumps start to pump out, kick out those positive ions. And then you have a higher concentration and pulling in the negative ions. So it returns back to negative 70 millivolts where this whole process can start again. One thing I've not mentioned yet is this fatty layer of cells called myelin. This makes the pore, so if my arm again is the axon, And if I had to have a message sent across it, each one of my skin pores had to open up so that message could move across it. That would go pretty slow, but if I wrapped it up in parts with insulators, then basically I could have a jumping of those openings happen where a positive charge could kind of bounce along there and go a lot faster. Actually, the difference is something like going 2 miles an hour to 200 some miles an hour when you have the myelin on there. So the myelin insulates and makes that message being sent faster. There is a problem with that. You can see here when the myelin's damaged and doesn't reproduce itself, this creates a condition called multiple sclerosis. And basically, I mean, you get replenishment of myelin on a regular basis, but if it doesn't do this because you have MS, then people have basically shorts in their neurons. And they won't know, a person who has this won't know from day to day whether they get up, whether they'll be able to move their arm, move their leg, walk, see, all sorts of things. This is a pretty devastating disorder to get, called multiple sclerosis, when the myelin does not replenish. I know I've covered a lot of material here today. I would like for you to read it in your book. I'd like for you to watch it, the video I'm going to post on Canvas. And as always, if you have any questions, you can contact me in class, in email. We can try to meet up through Zoom. I'm happy to do that. Take care.